Hi, this is Dr. Goldkamp, and welcome to the next episode of the Keto Naturopath on YouTube. So today we're going to talk about something people have asked for a lot, and we actually have a Facebook group on this as well. It's called Protein Sparing Modified Fast. What the heck is that? Why would you consider using it? And let's get a little history on this, and what's the good side of it? What's the good part of it? What's the bad side? Can you injure yourself with it? Have people injured themselves with it? What's the benefit? And what do we do? Okay. Let's get started. Okay, protein sparing modified fast. The reasons people consider doing this is primarily to lose weight, to drop fat, of course, but to preserve lean muscle mass. So, pretty straightforward. This is often used for bodybuilders that want to cut. They really want to drop down the percent body fat so they get that definition in their biceps and so on and so forth. And it works. However, you can't do it forever. This isn't something you do 365 days a year, 24/7. It's something you do intermittently, but if you have a focus like bodybuilders, and what they do is that they basically take supplements at the same time they're doing this. So intermittent, doing this sometimes and not other times, is my recommendation, and this is how we use this. And I've used this, for ourselves, my wife, Judi, and myself for the last couple of years. So we do maybe 3 days a week, 4 days a week. Once it proved to be effective, and Judi comes from a family history of obesity and diabetes. And so she has totally changed that past. And she's now her body weight that she was in high school, she says. And that's what she wants to be. In contrast to her family of origin, as they say, it's hugely different. She's dramatically changed her life. That and, of course, the ketogenic diet prior to that, nutritional ketosis. Okay, let's go on. So who needs to lose weight? Who needs to lose fat? Well, this just came from today. This is a quote I got out of a blog online for, I forgot what the blog is, but it's government-based. And so the state of obesity for 2020, basically through the pandemic, is that we're now over 40%. And it's the highest ever recorded. COVID-19 related food insecurity puts more Americans at risk for obesity or worsening obesity. It's huge. It's highest it's ever been. It's not decreasing, it's increasing. And COVID, the sheltering in place, put us over the top. So what are we going to do about that? This is obesity. This isn't even talking about the percentage of the population that is overweight. So you add overweight to this, it's huge. Not only is it heavy, it's unhealthy, it's metabolic disaster. It's cardiovascular for heart and for brain, fatty liver, a lot of directions you can go. Increased cancer rates. So what are we going to do about it? Well, it really begs the question of, if we're doing a protein-sparing modified fast and not a fast, what's the big deal about preserving your muscle mass? Why is that so important? Well, your muscle mass is your protein reservoir for your whole body. It is really what your immune system depends upon. So the short answer is, one's muscle mass has the highest association for all-cause mortality. That means dying from any cause at all, from accident, from illness, from breaking your hip, getting pneumonia. It's a big deal. So that speaks to the other aspect. What is the problem with not having enough muscle mass? Well, illness. Long story short, you're more prone to a lot of illnesses. This is a picture of what they call sarcopenia, which is under-muscled, insufficiently muscled. They have a reference called age-related sarcopenia. That is, as people get older, they tend to lose their muscle mass. And you can say, well, that makes sense. If you're thinking of the elder person in your life, your parents or your grandparents, and you go, well, they don't work out very much, so their muscles atrophy. Clearly, that absolutely is true, but that's not the only reason. So exercise, specifically muscle stress. And if we're talking about exercise, the most appropriate exercise to do to increase muscle mass is high-intensity, weight-resistant muscle training, or otherwise known as slow, high-intensity training. I won't tell you what that is, okay? And that's what we've been doing for the last 5 years. The other factor I want to say is that people get older, they have to stimulate your muscles more to preserve and to increase. So they have to do even more work than they did when they were 20. And so it can be done. It's very important as you get older to maintain and or increase your muscle mass if it's not sufficient already. Please remember that. That's very important. So here's an example of sarcopenia, undermuscled. It says underweight with low muscle mass. That's generally pretty bad. Normal weight with low muscle mass. That's otherwise known as TOFI. We'll get to that in a second. Sarcopenic obesity. That's being obese by fat measurement and also being undermuscled. So you have a double risk of various illnesses and so on. Okay? And then you have obese with normal muscle mass. Then you have obese with high muscle mass. You go, well, how is that even possible? Is there such things as being obese and having high muscle mass? And I will say that's a sumo wrestler. And here's an interesting thing about sumo wrestlers is that while they're wrestling, that is why they're working out and doing all that training and that part of their life, they are healthy because your muscles consume the glucose. So they bring your glucose down to normal levels, healthy levels. It's one of the points of exercise. So sumo wrestlers, it's very serious training. So they actually have normal, good, healthy glucose levels. Once they stop training, meaning they retired and they have all that weight, then they quickly go into being obviously obese, which they were before, but diabetic. And all the same consequences that diabetes, having consistent elevated glucose levels, consistent elevated insulin levels, etc., etc. So now on to TOFI, which is an acronym for thin on the outside and fat on the inside. That's another reference for obesity, but visually they are not obese. They are undermuscled. So if you were to measure by fat mass alone, they'd be considered obese. But because they're so undermuscled, have so little muscle tone, so little muscle tissue, that they are obese. And that's a very unhealthy situation to have as well. Okay, so where did all this get started? The protein-sparing modified fast. It is said that to have started in the 70s with this particular book and this particular diet. But frankly, I think it's really a component of an ancestral diet. So what do we mean by ancestral diet? The hunter-gatherer diet. Eating primarily animal products from head to tail. Well, if they ate animal products from head to tail, that means they'd be eating all the organ meats, which are very fatty, and all the muscle meats, which are not so fatty. And that's true. So when I say this is a portion of a part of ancestral diet, it's the meat part. It's not so much the fat. Anyway, back in early 1970s, and this book came out in 76, but it started before then, there's a Dr. Lin who put together in essence, a collagen formula, and it was a poor quality collagen formula. It was collagen protein, which is an incomplete source of protein. Hope you hear that. Collagen is an incomplete source of protein. It was made from slaughterhouse leftover byproducts. That doesn't sound all that attractive. The drink lacked complete protein, meaning it didn't have all 9 essential amino acids, and it created severe tissue loss in muscles and vital organs such as the heart. It caused electrolyte imbalance, and people died. So in terms of the record, they feel that 2 to 4 million people went on this diet at this point, and 60 were confirmed to have died of this, and it was basically a heart attack. It was an electrolyte imbalance that drove a heart attack. So that was not a good outcome. It was popularized by their book, hailed as a breakthrough in fighting obesity. Talk about a great name, huh? Last Chance Diet, Diet for the Depressed, Diet for the Desperate, more or less. That would probably be the sequel, Diet for the Depressed, the Disillusioned. Or this was a liquid protein diet. And the book sold 2.5 million copies in the United States and Canada. It was hugely popular. It grew into a $40 million business, big bucks at that time. There was 200 makers of this, and it was going nuts. The FDA finally had to step in and put this to bed. And so the prices for that dark syrupy liquid climbed from $8 for about 3 days worth to about $14, and it went up from there. So in 1977, liquid protein diet controversy. A year later, 1978, liquid protein turmoil intensifies, and so it was shut down quickly. There was too many deaths. Bad experiment. But what it showed is you need a complete source of protein. So I hope you're hearing this, that if you're going to do a protein-sparing modified fast, and myself being a naturopathic doctor, you have to use whole food sources of protein. That would be meat, that would be fish, that would be poultry, that would be pork, lamb, whatever you want to do. And you cut away the extra fat. It's about that simple. We do it about 3 or 4 days a week, as I mentioned before. But the problem is if you did this long term because you're feeling you really need to get into that bathing suit, or you're feeling rather desperate in some way, or you want to get your COVID 40 pounds off as quickly as possible, I would not do it all at once. Do it intermittent. Do 3 or 4 days a week, week after week after week until you get your goals. Because if you start depriving yourself of micronutrients and essential fatty acids, you'll drive yourself into this situation. A bad situation. However, some people do continue doing this for a whole month, but those people do take essential fatty acids, they take fish oil, and they also take supplements. So that part's up to you. I'd like to build a bigger picture about this because there is some really outstanding aspects to this protein-sparing modified fast, providing it using whole food sources. So speaking of collagen, collagen's incomplete source, among other things, it's deficient in tryptophan. If you think you're just going to pour collagen into your coffee and that's going to be your 30-day diet, do not do that. Do not do that. Among other things, you will drive yourself into a serotonin deficiency. You will drive yourself into a melatonin deficiency. And you'll be very anxious and you'll gradually become very depressed. You also, because collagen is also deficient in methionine, you will drive yourself into a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. In other words, you will create fatty liver even though you're losing weight. So do not do this with collagen only as your source of protein. Okay, got that point across. Methionine, which is not in collagen, is in meat, fish, poultry, whole food sources. Okay, so in 1996, now a good 20 years later, there was a whole different orientation. So 20 years later, what has been going on? You had the Atkins diet going on. It started pretty much in the 70s and 80s and the 90s. And that was a low-carb, high-fat variation of fat loss diet. And the protein power was basically a high-protein, low-carb, and a moderate fat. And so I've heard Dr. Eads talk a number of times, and he did, this was sensational. It became a whole movement. And as much as it wasn't his movement, he wrapped it up and put a bow around it and wrote a book about this, and people followed his recommendations and did very well. Recommended post-bariatric surgery. So when people get their stomachs tied or the various ways you can do bariatric surgery, which is to lose weight, a couple phenomenal things happen. One is if you have a diabetic and they have bariatric surgery, they will be a non-diabetic for a little while. They will drop a lot of weight for a little while, and then it will come back because the lifestyle they had before is what caused their diabetes and being obese. However, right after bariatric surgery, the one thing that they have to supplement, this is conventional medicine, the one thing that has to be supplemented is a protein drink. So they have to give 9 essential amino acids to bariatric surgery because they've cut off your ability to digest. Right? That's the trick. And there's various ways to do that. So they have to give a immediately absorbable by the body protein drink. So you can read between the lines. I'm saying bariatric surgery is very unhealthy. And if you're going to do it, then you do need to take lifestyle changes seriously. So the point, the whole food protein, use whole food protein when doing this as a complete form of amino acids. Make no mistake, long-term protein-sparing modified fast will create deficiencies, both macro and micro. You need your essential fatty acids, and you need your other amino acids. So eventually, you have to consider including multivitamin or including organ meats. You could include collagen. Why collagen if you're already doing meats? Collagen is pretty high in glycine. Glycine is low. It's not absent, but it's low in meats and fish and chicken. So that's why. Eggs to fulfill. Eggs in this context, egg yolk. Okay, take a look at the micronutrients. So this is a great graph that I borrowed from somebody else from Optimizing Nutrition. I like the graph, pretty straightforward. It gives the big picture. It's meat or high protein food are pretty good in everything, but they are missing some things, as I've said. So what can you do? So we have meat, chicken, fish, egg whites, all will give you this. That's great. You need to add liver or egg yolk, not during the fast, but on your non-fasting day. So if you're really focused on weight loss, you need to have liver and egg yolk or supplements that are going to make up the deficiencies that you are incurring by doing this. A big difference is you're not getting enough choline, you're not getting enough folic acid, and the highest form of folic acid in the world is liver. Okay, here is something very special. This is one of the things that I refer to as kind of a small miracle of a protein-sparing modified fast. Something I've seen is something that is really the root of more than just lose weight. So the idea is this, that I've already explained that as people get older, there's a thing called age-related sarcopenia, age-related muscle mass or atrophy. How do you counter that? Well, you can counter it by exercise. Talked about that. But you also can counter it by making sure that they have enough protein in their diet. And what is enough protein? Well, did you know that if you have a certain amount of protein, whole food source of protein, that you will stimulate muscle growth? So the other reason there is an age-induced sarcopenia, muscle mass loss, is because as people get older, they tend to eat less and less protein. So the small miracle that I'm referring to is that if you have at least 0.18 grams per pound of ideal body weight, and you have that up to ideal body weight, you need to have that much protein on any particular snack time. So what I did here in this particular, I just took gender neutral height from 4'10" to 6'2" and said average ideal weight for that, and calculated out what would 1.8 grams per pound of body weight be. So 1.8 grams per pound of ideal body weight of protein would equal this. So for a smaller person, roughly 20 grams at one time. At one sitting, have at least 20 grams, and that will stimulate it. If you have more, you're not going to stimulate more muscle mass. But if you have less, you're going to stimulate less. So it's the maximum benefit, the minimum amount of protein you should have in any particular meal or snack while you're going through a protein-sparing modified fast. Pretty cool, actually. So what is your ideal body weight? You can look that up. So I simply said let's say you're 100 pounds overweight, but your ideal body weight is 150 pounds. Well, that would be 150 grams of protein you should have in the course of the day, and then try to have, where would that 150 pound person be? Right here, and have at any one time at least 28 grams. So a small snack. That's not too heavy in the math, but that's the miracle. If you have just eating protein will stimulate muscle growth. That's a big deal. Okay, whey protein. Whey protein, you see that in the gym a lot, that, oh, I have to have my whey protein, Well, whey protein is a byproduct of cheese manufacturing. And in the perfect world, especially in Italy and France and so on, in the rural farms, what they would do is they would have cheese manufacturing of raw dairy, cow milk, and the whey, they would give it to the pork. And the pork would consequently be really tasty pork. So it's not just individual amino acids that's in whey. There's other proteins, there's other byproducts of the cheese making. We used to use whey back in the late 1990s and early 2000, and we still do in certain cases. If somebody is really immune deficient, they just can't get out of it. Sometimes whey is very helpful to help support their immune system as an independent factor. So often we'd have that with certain cancer patients and so on. It was popular at that point. So just know that there are some benefits to whey, but I wouldn't use whey exclusively as your form of protein. Again, whole food source of protein is what you should use for. So 3 concepts about protein that you probably never heard about. One is, if I give you a donut, if I gave you steak or piece of meat, and if I gave you an avocado in this particular case, each one of those would take a different amount of energy for the same caloric amount. So they're isocaloric, same caloric amount. It would take you many more calories to burn, to digest the protein. It would take far fewer calories to burn for fats. That's 6, hardly any. It's almost immediately usable by the body. And then there's more. So this is a great diagram basically showing protein. One of the reasons protein is so beneficial is so much has to be consumed. So it says if you started with 200 calories and you minus the 60 calories it would cost you to digest and metabolize protein, you'd be left with a net of 140. When you can compare that versus a donut, very refined carbohydrates, you'd have nearly all of that remaining, not much. And even fats are even more efficient. So that's one reason protein, and it's very satiating. That's the second miracle. As you eat protein, and by the way, when you eat protein, a whole food source of protein, of course there's some fat in there. And yes, there is some carbs in there too. Very little, of course. It's a remnant of the glycogens storage. So I mentioned you become satiated. So as the amount of protein increases in terms of being 100% of your diet, you can't get to be 100%, as I mentioned. There is some fat, and there is some carbs in meat and chicken, but not much. It's mostly protein, obviously. But as that becomes your complete diet for that day, your appetite drops down. So it's self-regulatory. You're not limiting yourself to a specific set number of calories. You're just making sure you're having protein. And your body will burn the fat as the extra energy it needs. And that's basically how it works. Your appetite decreases, so you make it good. Enjoy the meat and proteins that you have. So this is a difference. People ask about very low carbohydrate diet. When I use this reference, I go less than 20 grams per carbs per day when people will work with us. This is the protein sparing modified fast, and they're saying on average people have about 800 calories. So that's about a 1,200 on an average adult, 1,200 calorie drop. On a very low calorie diet, that's in essence starving, it's a mixed bag. So this is how these line up. Have no doubt that a protein sparing modified fast is a fast. It's a temporary shock to your metabolism. So what does that mean? So that means we don't all start in the same place. So if people were on keto, that is, they actually were living day to day with, in my way of doing it, 20 grams, that's a classic ketogenic diet, less than 20 grams of fat per day, they would have no problem starting a protein sparing modified fast. It wouldn't be a problem. It would probably be easier in many ways. But for those who are coming from the standard American diet, which is high fat and high carbohydrate, and they say, oh my gosh, this is what I've been eating during the shelter in place during the pandemic, I just want to drop this weight, and they quickly go to protein only, they will have problems. They need to make a gradual transition. For those people, why the gradual transition? It's not just about metabolism. It's about you need to change out your whole microbiome. You need to upregulate the bacteria and the viruses and so on that digest protein, and you downregulate. Obviously, you're not having carbs. They're not going to stay around. So it takes a while, a number of weeks, I believe, to shift into that comfortably. I've seen people jump from, though they never admit they're on a high-fat, high-carb diet, when they jump into just a protein-sparing modified fast, they will have problems. We'll get into some of those problems. Most proteins can be used by the liver to create more glucose, but not all. So for those who are worried about their glucose levels, they will see, so for instance on a CGM, they'll see their glucose rise just a little bit. If they're at the 70s, it might go up to the 90s. That's what happens to me. But you stay at the 90s because there is a conversion. So this is a picture of individual amino acids that can be converted to glucose, so glucogenic, and there's a few that are ketogenic. So what you have is a greater supply of things that are going to be switched over to making glucose. So you're never going to be glucose deficient. Your body has the ability through gluconeogenesis to make glucose. So you'll see a slight average increase, but it doesn't go up. It's not like having donuts. You're not going to have 120, 140, or 200 readings for glucose. So let's go to people who've actually gone through the program. And so what do they say? They're measuring glucose, ketones, weight, etc. This is one person's very analytical graph. There's their weight. They lost weight. This is just a week they did. We all did this for a week. Weight loss, body fat, etc., etc. Ketones changed. This person had their ketones go up. That's interesting. Most people, it stays the same, and some, depending on their former diet. Here is somebody else. This was, what's their weight? This person looks like they gained weight. Don't know why that is. Don't have the story behind it. Here was something else. Here's a problem person had. They had explosive poops, explosive bowel movements. This was a person that was obviously eager to lose weight, but didn't spend the time doing that transition. We do not all start in the same place. So it isn't a one size fits all. I think it does fit everybody eventually, but not initially. So you have to think about if you're having a lot of donuts and a lot of other things, you got to change that. Think of your gut, think of your microbiome, and your metabolism is going to change. So this speaks to how that metabolism, that microbiome did not have enough time to adapt to that. But that's actually fairly common to go from either being constipated to loose stools. But that changes. It changes over time. It's not a problem. Somebody's glucose went up. As I just explained, it went up from their 70s to 100. They didn't know what that was about. Explained that. Their weight went down. They lost 8 pounds. Here's what we do. It's Judi's hands. So we make a protein bread. So there's a little mayo in that. I don't know if that's, I think that's sardines. So it's little sardines with a little mayo, a little bit of fat to make a spread. She puts it on her protein bread. And I find making the protein bread is a real treat. And here's somebody's chicken. There's the protein bread that Judi makes, and there's how the protein bread ends up. We do exercises throughout the day. That's what we recommend. And so I'm going to stop there and saying that's just part one. We'll get into some details later, but till next time, Dr. Goldkamp.